All right, going to share my screen. Awesome. Well, welcome, Sister Marianne Farina, or my relationship with her is Dr. Farina. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about compassionate listening, especially in the context of someone going through a mental health crisis. And just last week we had Dr. Francis Clooney talk about a Catholic perspective on cases of mental illness and how the Catholic tradition has dealt with it. And then I think we're going to get into something that is a theme that we did discuss. We broached the topic, but I'm excited that we're going to be diving into it. So thank you so much, Sister Marianne, for agreeing to, have this conversation.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Imran, for inviting me to this conversation.
You're welcome. So a bit about Sister Marianne. Dr. Marianne Farina is a nun or a member of the Sisters of the Holy Cross. She is part of the core faculty at the Graduate Theological Union, as well as the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, California. She's a really cool person. I first came across her when I heard her give a speech at the Zaytuna College graduation ceremony, and she was quoting Aquinas, she was quoting Imam al-Ghazali, and I was like, who is this lady? Like, who she's so well read in both Islam and Christianity. And it turns out she's been one of the champions for a Muslim college to be established and to continue its management in Berkeley, California. So I've learned a lot from her. I first emailed her because of my interests in early childhood education and Sunday schools, and so she knows a lot about that. And then when I became a student at the Graduate Theological Union, uh, I took her course on uh, Christian Muslim dialogue, and that's where I learned the discipline of comparative theology. I really appreciated how many notes she would write on my papers, so I asked her to be on my thesis committee, and she was one of the people who read my thesis, gave me honors, which was something very flattering. And because of her recommendations, I was able to get a position at the Divinity School at Harvard to study under Dr. Francis Clooney. So, Dr. Marianne Farina has her PhD from Boston College in theological ethics. Her areas of research are church social justice, comparative theology, interfaith dialogue, and she specializes in one medieval theologian named um, Thomas Aquinas. She has many specialties, but Thomas Aquinas, according to her page, is the main thinker that she will use to have dialogue with people like Imam al-Ghazali in the Muslim world. And she knows a lot about Imam al-Ghazali, more so than the average Muslim. So she's well read in many, many areas. I've benefited from her, and one of the things that I appreciated about her bio is she writes, the synonym for dialogue is learning. And so I sensed I came from a world of apologetics, of debate, of convincing someone else through the art of argumentation. And when I came into her dialogue course, I sensed that there was a radically different approach to when it comes to interacting with people of the different faith. And it had to do about listening. It had to do about learning. It had to do less about, well, here's my way and here's how this is what I need to tell you. And so I found that to be enlightening. It changed my approach to religious studies, to seeking the truth. And then I thought, well, let me invite Sister Marianne and talk about compassionate listening, because not only is she someone that's in the academic space, but she's someone who's been out on the field, and she has listened to people who are suffering. She knows people who are going through illnesses in life, and has worked with them and has applied these tools of what we're going to talk about today, of compassionate listening. Well, that was my monologue introduction for Sister Marianne. I hope that did some justice to you.
Thank you. Thank you. You were very generous. And I would have to say, on my part, it was just a pleasure to have Imran in both the GTU programs and as a student of Zaytuna. He was a stellar model, really, for the kind of education that Zaytuna could provide, and the way he was able then to let it flower in a graduate program. And I believe he will continue to see it flowering in various fields and in further development of your studies, Imran. I also want to say that if there's a particular word that I would associate with you, it would be the word of generosity, because you were a very unique student in our class in the sense that you made sure that everyone could contribute in the class and you encouraged others to contribute in the class. And so it was a real pleasure to have a student like you in the circle so that our students together, we could, as a community of learning, that we could really thrive and could
Mm.
learn from one another. So I want to thank you for your openness and your generosity and your encouragement of students who, as we know, like to kind of sit in the background and not going to open their mouths, but you encouraged them and you asked questions directly to the students, which was the first time in the 20 years that I was teaching at DSPT that any student had actually done that.
Oh,
So, so thank you for your generosity, your deep interest in others as you are going through the learning process yourself.
I suppose I broke protocol, or I guess it was a dialogue class. So I was like, let me just jump into the dialogue straight away.
Yes, exactly.
I
But
think
you
there
did
were
it in a
two.
beautiful way. You did it in a way that was not like curious as to what the Christian thought of the idea, or the other Muslim who was, the other Muslim community students. But you did it in such a way that the student felt encouraged or felt that they had a safety net. You were going to protect them
Mhm.
or you were going to help them contribute. If you remember, Imran, that was the class where we had a student from Ghana
Yes.
who felt claustrophobic in the classroom. And so we had to keep the doors and windows open. Do you remember?
Yes. Yes.
Yes,
I think I,
yes.
yes. I think
Father
we
from Ghana.
connected.
Yes,
Yes. I
yes.
think he recently connected with me on social media.
Wonderful. Yes. Beautiful man, but our classroom was too small for him. So the dialogue we were doing, if you recall, was also somehow being broadcast into the gallery area and the
Mm.
common public space. And
Mm.
I learned later that there were people who sat on the couches outside and listened to our dialogue.
Oh, wow.
They were happy to see this exchange. So you were a teacher yourself.
It's powerful, some of the those 3 hour sessions that we would have. We would enter and come out with just layers and layers of new knowledge, of old assumptions tested and challenged. So I would always come out feeling layers of, new light and enlightenment.
Yes, indeed.
Well, it seems like there was a lot of listening happening in that classroom, and I appreciate your saying that I seem to have some tendency of being able to do that as well with my. I've always been told that I ask good questions because it's just a curiosity of mine. I'm a curious person. I like to ask questions. And so we can segue into our first question. Um, our first question is, you in your world of research and in your life of practice, how do we compassionately listen to people's suffering? More broadly speaking, suffering is part of the human condition, but I'm interested in BP Harmony to talk about the suffering of those who are enduring mental illness.
Thank you for the question. First, I have to say that really, when we say compassionate listening, what I am referring to is that competency to listen deeply. And in that way, to engage with other people, especially in their suffering or times when they're feeling, um, especially feelings of pain, of loss, of suffering, um, of inadequacy, of being unaccepted, to really kind of engage with them, and to listen to them and to listen to their suffering. Being able to not, deep listening is really listening for what's going on in a person's life, how they are feeling, and what's important in that person's life. So often in our listening, we kind of skim the surface. We don't have the skills to listen deeply. We have the ability, the biological ability to hear. We have two ears and we can certainly hear sound. But can we listen? I think that is something that we really have to practice. And in our spiritual traditions, as well as in our social practices, there are many ways that we seek to listen to one another. In our spiritual practices, we pray. So we have this idea of really listening to God's word deeply, and and trying to understand what it is that God is asking of us as individuals, as a community. So we listen to God's word, whether it's in the Bible, the Quran, the Torah. We listen to it, whether it's in the sutras. We listen to the idea of what it is that the Spirit is trying to tell us, what it is that God is trying to communicate. We also develop, therapies where there are listening. We have those therapies that are out of the medical profession, as well as the social services profession, the healing profession, where listening is an important part of connecting with the person, especially the person who is suffering. We want to listen for what it is that is happening in their lives that is having an impact on their understanding of their situation, their understanding of themselves. The reason I gravitate towards compassionate listening as a particular package or a particular way of learning, compassionate listening was founded by Leah Green and Jean Knutson, and it is a project that really is trying to teach a language, and it's called the language of the heart. Compassionate listening is trying to help people speak from the heart and listen with the heart. And so it's this idea of deep listening from the core of one's being. Now, again, when it comes to listening and trying to experience what's going, help people to share their experiences, we know there are also other methods that are usually used. There is, conflict resolution methods. There is such a thing as Marshall Rosenberg has done, which is called nonviolent communication,
Yeah.
where you follow the observation, the feelings, the needs, and requests of others. What makes compassionate listening so different from any of these therapies I've spoken about, any of these spiritual practices, or even Marshall Rosenberg's effort, is that compassionate listening is getting into the DNA of the simple but profound act of listening, of being present. So we're not asking the person to, when we're sitting with the person and he or she is sharing what's going on in her life, we're not judging it, we're not offering advice, we're not categorizing it, we're not searching for our next question as the person speaks. We're just fully present. And our presence is saying, I am here for you. I am here for you.
Hmm.
And that's the simple practice of being fully present through the act of deep listening. And it has no other agenda. I think, even with the good practice of nonviolent communication that Marshall Rosenberg has developed,
Right.
there's an agenda. There's an agenda to try to resolve a conflict. Well, when you're working with somebody who's suffering, yes, they're in conflictual situations. And yes, there are times when there are conflicts in their lives and you think you need to help them address those conflicts and somehow transcend those conflicts. Absolutely. But the transcending of those conflicts are going to only happen when they realize a community that is just there for them, listening, not trying to cure them, not trying to offer advice, and not also seeking solutions for them or for groups like them, as if you were doing a study. No, it's just really being present to the person and allowing her or him to just pour their heart out. And I think in the process of listening and spending time with the person, quality time, without trying to think of what will be my next question or how should I direct what they're saying or how should I counteract what they're saying, they realize that you have no other agenda. You are just there. And so the trust builds up in the two of you or the three of you. Sometimes this can happen in a group as well. We have compassionate listening circles and we may be 5 or 8 people and we truly listen. And not only do we identify, at least able to absorb what it is that the person is feeling, we also recognize and respect the values that the person has. And when we do have an exchange, we acknowledge, well, it seems to me that you are having these feelings. And then you ask for correction. Is this correct? Is this what you're feeling? And then the person, because that trust level at the first was developed, can share what she is feeling or he is feeling. Or you might say, connecting with your community seems to be of value to you. Did I hear this correctly? Is it community life, or is it the idea that you can't find meaningful work? Is this the value you want to contribute to society? And then you allow the person to share more. So you ask questions not because you're curious, but you ask questions because you want the person to feel that they could share even more, go even deeper with you. And I think in some of the other communicative processes that talk about holistic communication, there is a back and forth, and they talk about listening empathetically so that the person can voice his or her values, his or her feelings. But what's beautiful about compassionate listening is that you hear it. The person doesn't even have, I mean, you want to check it to make sure you're hearing correctly, but the person doesn't have to force it. You're not forcing them, you're hearing it. And then the person recognizes, oh my God, she truly knows me.
Hmm.
She truly knows me. It's an intimate moment, Imran, that compassionate listening allows us to reach. And I spell intimacy this way: into me, see.
Hmm.
And then that's that deep connection. So you're suffering, yes, but there's somebody who's accompanying you, who sees you in the suffering, and that's an important practice to learn how to be present to that person.
Hmm.
Now, one of the also the roots of compassionate listening comes from Thich Nhat Hanh's mindfulness training. As we know in Buddhism, there are pronounced the Four Noble Truths, and the noble truths that that, the first noble truth is that we suffer. We suffer not just physically, but because we don't reach the goals that we want, because of our ideas of, we suffer loss, we suffer pain, we suffer limitations. And the second noble truth is that the root of all that suffering is desire. We have the wrong desires. We need to get our thinking straight. We have the desire like we can control things, or that we could find the clear path to reach our goals. And and then the third noble truth is that when you get rid of these false desires, the suffering ends. And then the fourth noble truth is, well, how do we get rid of the desires? And it's to find the eightfold path, which
Yeah.
is right thinking, right? And right speech and right acting.
Mhm.
And they're grouped under that. Well, Thich Nhat Hanh goes even deeper when he's talking about what he calls the five mindfulness trainings. And the the fourth mindfulness training is this idea of deep listening. And so if we can deep listen to the person deeply, we can allow them to pour out his or her heart, and that becomes a process for their moving to a sense of wholeness,
Mhm.
of feeling accepted and understood. Now, of course, the basic premise for Thich Nhat Hanh is the premise that he talks about, and that is interbeing, that you and I are not separate, we are connected, and that all the world is about relationships. It's interesting. Thich Nhat Hanh's thinking of interbeing, or sometimes when you hear his talks, he talks about inter-are. You and I are. It isn't that I am, it's you and I are. Listen to the physics of this wonderful physicist, astrophysicist by the name of Carlo Rovelli. He has written a number of books, and he basically says at the root of what our world is, it's about relationships. It's about connecting. Everything connects. And I think, Ravelli must be a Buddhist.
It's there's so much in this response. What I've gathered in my notes is that this is a discipline that comes from Leah Green. And is there a book that's been written
Yes,
on compassionate
yes.
listening?
There's a book, Compassionate Listening. Yes.
Okay. I'll definitely check that out. And it's inspired by numerous people. One of the things that I'm taking away is um, coming with no agenda,
Mm,
coming with no particular goal in mind, and that being an important piece for the one who is suffering to feel first that this person is simply here to listen, and that really allows for someone
mhm,
to unfold and the way to do that is to reflect back and to say, is this what I'm hearing? So things like more tactical tools, which um, I think you're doing a workshop here in Houston pretty soon on these tools. But the reason this perked my ears is because I was recently talking to a couple, and you could tell very clearly that the husband very much wanted the wife to take medication. And I
mm,
could tell very much that that was the direction he wanted me to take the conversation as well. My work as a mental health coach is to be an advocate for the person who is suffering, whether that be with medication or not. Um, it is up to the person to a certain extent, uh, but it is to help them see whether or not something like medication is going to help out with their life. If without medication, there's disruptions to their own life, and helping them see it for themselves, but before I can even do that, you have to gain that trust. So I appreciate that one of the ways of doing that is presenting oneself as having no agenda. Um, so
Yes, and yeah, and I think the idea too is we appreciate science, and of course we appreciate the art of medicine. I always remind myself that it's an art.
mm,
And you know, and so you don't want to just turn our backs on the scientific community, but the scientific community could learn a lot by by understanding what is really going on in the person and giving time for what might be not being formulaic in a person's experience. Who knows? I mean, there could be so many creative ways that medicines and other therapies are used. Um, but we do end up being formulaic. Okay, you've got this disease, you take this antibiotic. Okay, you got this, we do this. And if it's not on your, recently I had to take a whole stint of antibiotics, and they didn't recommend one because it was on my protocol sheet that I had an allergic reaction when I was like 18 years old. And I said, you know what? I'm in my 70s now. I think I might have grown out of that. so, so, I mean, medicine is not interested in sometimes.
yeah.
So, yeah. So I think some sort of combination
Mm,
is what is needed when we're working with very complex, each person is complex.
yeah.
We're just not, laboratory rats, and even every laboratory rat is complex. I believe any sentient being is complex.
Well, I appreciate you breaking down this answer into the what, like what is compassionate listening? It is an actual discipline that can be studied. And I appreciate that you put it into a broader perspective, that it's not a simply Catholic tool. It is something that is a tool that can be used by anyone. And that I'm sure through the work. I'm not sure if Leah Green, correct me, is she from the Catholic Church or is she
No,
even
Leah
from?
is she's comes from the Jewish tradition,
Okay.
and Jean Knudsen is a Christian, and she comes from Friends, uh, the Friends Society, or the Mennonite tradition.
Hmm.
And I want to add too, Imran, just briefly before we move into your next question. This is the methodology of Jesus.
Hmm.
Jesus was a compassionate listener. The
Yeah.
way Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God, he didn't say, hurry up and get ready. He said, it's already here, and it's here as I listen to you. It's here as I teach you. It's here as I heal. And so Jesus also taught his disciples, like ourselves, to be compassionate listeners, to listen more than we speak, to be witnesses, um, to receive all kinds of people from all walks of life with tenderness and readiness to be with them. He
This
ate
is
with the outcasts of the society. He
this
sat
is
around
so
table and had conversation with them.
yeah.
So it's this openness, this generosity.
This is so important because not only people with bipolar come to me, but it's their family members who
Sure.
they feel lost, they feel frustrated, and this idea of training people on how to um, manage someone who is going through a mental illness. Compassionate listening like you're saying, is relevant to someone um, who might be losing their minds trying to take care of someone who may not be at their best.
Right. Right. And again, you know, the thing when I look at the model of Jesus, when Jesus um, was accompanying those who society had cast aside. He wasn't showing just mercy that they had been outcast from the society. He was bringing them into the society. He's bringing them in. He made them disciples, some of those outcasts. And so what that means is, so we have a member of our family who is suffering something, suffering either limitations, suffering any kind of, challenge for them mentally or physically. How do we make them feel that it's not that we're doing a grand gesture by inviting them around our table? How do we help them to understand they belong around our
Yeah.
table?
Yeah.
My open heart belongs to you. It isn't that I'm doing you a favor by sitting next to you and listening to you. I belong to you.
Hmm.
My heart belongs to your heart.
Hmm.
And
This,
I think that that's what Jesus was doing. That's what Thich Nhat Hanh means when he says interbeing.
yeah.
You know, I belong to you. We are all children of God. I belong to you, however you are. Now,
Hmm.
we know that the person who is suffering doesn't want to suffer all their life. They will look at ways that they could, address the suffering, relieve the suffering, limit the suffering. And you can accompany them in all of that. But first, you have to let them know that they belong to you
Hmm.
and that your suffering and their suffering are one.
Hmm. I think this is a good segue into our next question, which you've already begun to answer, but maybe we can dive into it a bit deeper, is how do we understand this idea of compassionate listening from Jesus in the Bible?
Yes, and as I said, he reminded even Jesus. We say in the Bible that one of the chapters, especially in Mark's gospel, says that the crowd was stunned because Jesus taught with authority. Because Jesus taught with authority. Well, that didn't mean he had a PhD in theological ethics. What, or he was a graduate of the rabbinical school of his time. No, it meant that he knew the people, he knew their stories. He
Hmm.
had accompanied them for 30 years before he branched out to preach about the kingdom having flowered among them already. Um, I shared earlier with you that I had a tremendous experience of being with people and being with people of different religions and different cultures when I spent 12 years in Bangladesh. And in Bangladesh, we lived in the city. We had some institutions in Dhaka city, but we also had projects that we work with rural areas like Mymensingh and specifically Jalchatra, which was a place that I had been, for a number of years. Um, and in Jalchatra, we traveled village to village to different village schools. And we work with Muslims and Christians in these villages. And I would often spend weekends in the village because they were far away, sometimes 20 miles away. And we would have programs at night, programs in the morning. And one evening, I was spending time with a family in Bangladesh, and the carpenter of that uh, was called by the family to help build a barn door for their farm. And the carpenter came with his toolkit and his son. And the family had already cut down one of their trees to make for the wood for the barn door. And the carpenter stayed for 3 days, the same 3 days I was there at the family home, to build the door. And
Mhm.
at night, after we would have our rice, in that tradition, we always have rice around 9 o'clock at night. So after we had our rice, we were sitting on the porch, the mud porch, and we were telling stories. And
Hmm.
the stories were stories about what was happening in the village. They were also gossip stories. What happened to this family? What happened to that family? And then it dawned on me. We talk about Jesus as a carpenter. And I think mentally, when I was a little girl, the idea was that Joseph, Jesus's patron and father, earthly father, had a shop, and Jesus worked in the carpentry shop. But when you think of the older cultures, they didn't have necessarily shops. They were itinerant. Uh, they were itinerant craftsmen.
Right.
So maybe the blacksmith had a location because he needed a fire, but a carpenter just needed his toolbox.
Right.
And it was true because the minute I left on Monday morning, when I left the village, the carpenter got word that in a village 3 miles north, they needed a carpenter, and he and his son were packing things up to go there. And I thought, that's what Jesus did. He was a carpenter, so he was itinerant carpenter. He went from family to family to family to family, and he gathered stories. Okay, so now he wants to talk about the kingdom of God breaking upon us. He uses those stories. He just changes the ending to show that God's love and mercy is the final word. So a man had two sons. The younger one asked the father for an inheritance. The minute he started that story, I'm sure in the crowd said, "Oh, I know that family. They live in that village." And they expect the ending being that the father accepted the prodigal son who went away, came back broke and poor, accepted the son to be his servant. But in Jesus's version, he accepted his son as his son,
Yeah.
not only accepted him, but threw a party and said he was lost and now he is found.
Mm.
And the impact that that had on the people was profound. Oh my goodness, this is a God who rejoices that we come back to God regardless of anything that we have done in the past. This is a merciful God. And the kingdom is about mercy. It's
Yeah.
about acceptance. It's about love. It's about accompaniment.
This
So I think Jesus is using stories, using the people's stories. That's the authority with which he taught.
I'm glad you started off with that scene and then rewind and told how that scene was the culmination of a lifetime of compassionate listening.
Mhm.
However, one of the challenges I see for myself, and broadly speaking, in a social media context where attention spans are short, we are not
Mm,
really present with one another. I find it to be a real challenge for us to be able to deeply listen, to have that sense or that
mm,
habit, that really using that
yes.
almost Aristotelian term is that
Mhm.
habit of listening, which would lead to this culminating scene that you describe in the Bible of Jesus preaching with authority. I find it our context to be particularly challenging to cultivate this ability.
Right. You speak well, Imran. Yes, it's a habitus. It is a virtue for us to truly listen in the way that I'm talking about. Then how do you cultivate the virtue? You do have to create certain practices, certain trainings. And one of the important trainings is to spend time in silence, to turn off our screens, you know, and to be able, so 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 11 minutes of just turning everything off and just spending time in silence,
But
taking a
Sister
walk.
Marianne, I sleep for 7 to 8 hours every night. Is that not silence?
No, because it is. Um, and I think that that sleep is very important, especially if you're going to have the patience for any kind of training. But I do think it's the idea of you saying to yourself, I'm shutting things off now. I'm turning the screens off and I'm going to sit and I'm going to just sit and concentrate just on sitting. I think that's important because that's a conscious decision to really interrupt your day. You know, I admire the 5 times a day prayer of the Muslim community. Why? Because I think the Prophet Muhammad was a genius in that. You have to shut down during the day and just stop. And I know it's hard to really keep attentive when you're doing your ritual prayer. And yes, you could be going through the motions of the raka and you could be distracted for sure. But at least you stop what you were doing and you're going to try to concentrate now on this prayer. And I think that's helpful also. In Catholic theology, we have the morning and we also have the little hours where we do stop at 10, 11, and 12. We call those the little hours of prayer. And then we have midday prayer, and then we have evening prayer when the sun goes down, and then we have night prayer before we go to sleep. Each of those points could be used for what I'm saying will train us to stop and to truly listen. If we would just take a few minutes before that prayer and just shut it all down. And yes, it does take training. It doesn't come automatically. It takes that kind of training in concentration and in silence and in meditation. And sometimes it's helpful to do it as a group, um, like one of the groups that I belong to on Sunday evening. Before we begin our sharing of the teachings, we spend 5 to 10 minutes on the screen, but silent. And
Mm.
this helps us all to enter into. So, I think,
I guess the question in the person who might challenge is that how is this productive? We are
ah,
stuck in a very productive mindset, and
that's right.
so how does this silence help me become more productive in this skill that I'm trying to acquire of compassionate listening?
Because it allows us to be comfortable in the silence. It's allowing us to kind of get used to the silence, to shutting things off, for there to be no input. And it's true, our mind still is a monkey mind, and it'll go all kinds of places. But the idea is to just sit, and sometimes it's breathing, learning how to breathe. It's amazing, and this has been done in psychology, that before, when a person is enraged about something, if they stop and breathe deeply 3 times, they get control of themselves again. How amazing. you know so I mean, that's just 3 breathings. Imagine actually stopping for 5 minutes.
Right.
And so I think it builds a capacity, right? And so that's what you want to do. You want to build a capacity for it. Now, I know we are in a very productive minded consciousness. We absolutely are. And well, where is this getting me? I don't see this getting me anywhere. And that's where we need trust in the practice itself and in the discipline. And we need really sacrifice. I know that word sacrifice, people say, oh, what do we mean by sacrifice? Well, sacrifice that notion that I have to be productive every single moment, um, and recognize that maybe the best way to be productive is to be unproductive for 5 minutes.
Mm.
But again, I think it's just developing that capacity to just stop and yeah, step away from the constant ongoing and doing and doing and doing. And I'm afraid that ever since Facebook was invented and the cell phone was invented, we have been trained the total opposite, of 180 degrees in a different direction.
Yeah.
Whereas in the ancient times, or even in earlier times, when I lived in an age, and again, I'm dating myself, where the TV went off at 11 o'clock.
Yeah, and then we're
Right.
static, right?
That was it. It was just the national anthem was on, and that was it.
Yeah.
you know. So I and we didn't have CNNs, and we didn't have 24-hour news.
Yeah.
When the news was broadcast from 11 to 11:30, it would stop.
Right.
And we also during those times, we also had practices that helped us to transition from a very busy part of the day to the relaxing part of the day, like you were talking about in terms of sleeping. I love to tell this story about my parents. They always watched the 11 o'clock news in New York, my mother and father, Catherine and Frank Farina. And the news would come on at 11. And around 11:10, my mother would say to my father, Frank, do you feel like a cup of tea? And every night my father would say, sure, Catherine, I feel like a cup of tea. And she put the water on for tea. And at the end of the 11 o'clock news, they would have a cup of tea. Now, we children saw that as our advantage. Anytime we would have a special request or permission from our parents, we would make sure that the bid got in before 11:10 so that it might be a topic of conversation at the end of the day. But more likely it was not. It was really my parents compassionately listening to each other about the day.
Mm.
And then they went to bed.
Mm.
What a beautiful custom.
Yeah.
So what are those that we can do with each other that will help us to kind of transition, to settle down, to move from the kind of frenzy of media or frenzy of what we're doing and
Yeah.
just be? That'll help us to even enter into the meditative types of training I'm talking about. So we do need some steps along the way for sure.
Yeah, and I know it's a bit of a tangent, but I didn't realize the connection between this question and the next question. A lot of people struggling with mental illness, they are feeling as if no one knows what they're going through. It
Mm,
feels like it, and I think we've gone into a bit of what our modern culture, society in general, that because of the distractions, we are not doing things we were doing as a species. And this is why people who are suffering suffer unnecessarily or a bit longer than they should, because there aren't these pegs in the day where people are checking in,
right.
either with their Lord or with, as you be described, this nightly ritual in your family.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes, absolutely.
so um, you've definitely drawn from an eclectic source of inspiration. And I think you can answer as a Catholic, as someone who specializes in comparative religions. For someone struggling with mental illness, what advice do you have for someone struggling in their faith? And it has to do with questions about, well, why me? Doesn't God love me, or is God upset with me? They seem childish, but even I thought I was a kind of like a level 9 Muslim, with my Islamic studies and my masters and being part of, taking tariqah very seriously. And when I went through it, I found myself asking these questions like, why, have I done something wrong? And am I not one of the people who is true in their faith because I'm wavering now? Uh, so so yeah, some just practical advice about what you might have dispensed in your time on the field in Bangladesh or even today and in your work.
Thank you. Again, thank you for such a great question. Um, yes, I think we are all struggling, and especially for those who are struggling to try to understand why this is happening to me. I think what I had said earlier is is to accompany them so that they understand that they are not being isolated, that we are present with them and that their suffering is connected to us and we are connected to them. And so they don't see themselves as an island of suffering, not connected to anyone else. So hopefully through the practice of listening, we can do that. I think also that it's important to recognize that God is present and God has not gone away. I learned this lesson very much from the people on the Shandip Island when the cyclone hit Bangladesh in 1992. We went down there to help with relief efforts, and we expected people to be desperate. You know, why has God done this to us? What's going on? Where have we sinned? Why is God wrath being a part of our lives at this time? And I didn't find that. When I went down there, I found them saying in the Bengali phrase, Allah Janen, God knows. And what they meant by that is knows me, knew me before this tragic cyclone. God knows me during this tragic cyclone. And God will know me as I move out of this tragedy. So God knows me before, now, and in the future. And I think when we are truly present to the person in compassionate listening, we witness to the fact that God has not gone away, that God is present to them.
Mm.
And I think just consistently being present to them, being open to them, giving them the gift of listening will help them. I can't give them advice and say, well, now go to church every day and somehow your faith will come back, or be sure you do your 5 prayers. And of course, God will be there. God is there. And we, through our compassionate listening, can be witnesses to them that God is still present. And if that can somehow be visualized, realized by them, and then I think slowly, slowly they will begin to perhaps open up to the ways that God is calling them back to God's self, whether it's through Islam, whether it's through Catholicism, Christianity, or Judaism. I think that helping them to recognize that God is truly with them. He's always creating in them. We say, God created me. Gosh, I think theologically, that's a bad phrase. God's creating me.
Mm.
It's ongoing. And
Every
so, okay,
moment. Yeah.
yeah, every moment I am being recreated. And so this suffering too is somehow uh, God is working through this with me and not punishing me and giving this to me. What God is giving me is ongoing life, ongoing creativity,
Mm.
ongoing and your tenderness with them will help them to recognize that God is doing something new in their hearts and their lives.
Mm. Yeah, there was an expression we grew up with is if God brought you to it, he can certainly bring you through it.
There, exactly. And I think that's what the people of Bangladesh were saying about knowledge, not janin. You
Mm.
know, again, that word janin doesn't mean that you have book knowledge. It means intimate knowledge, like
Mm.
a husband knows a wife, that
Yeah.
kind of intimacy. Yeah,
Mm. Again, then how do we feel that sense of um God is with me? And I can ask this from the perspective of a Muslim where we ask the question of, well, how do I know that this difficulty is a trial, is a test
mm,
versus a punishment? This was a big question during the COVID era. This was a big question that the nation, the country was asking. How do we, from the Catholic perspective or any other, how do we know? I know that there are certain formulaic answers from the Islamic tradition, but I was just curious to hear your perspective.
right. My understanding of how God is ongoing, God's presence is ongoing and creative, is that what we say in the book of Genesis is that all the things that God created, he said that they were good, and that the goodness remains. And part of creation is giving us free will, giving us the ability to choose the good as God has designed or as God is designing or not.
Hmm.
And I think we would be automatons if we didn't have free will, but that's part of who we are. And so things are going to unfold in ways that we can't imagine. And part of it is our own doing, is
Mm,
our own working with the graces that God is continually giving us. And so it feels like God is punishing us. It feels like God has walked away. It feels like God is testing us. But we are punishing, God doesn't punish, God only wills goodness. And I think the test for us is to reconnect with the way that God is wishing the goodness and the wholeness. And yes, I'm suffering from a physical challenge, I'm suffering from a mental challenge. But even within that, there is something new that God is doing for me. What is it? What is it? If we focus only on the challenge, we don't see all the other ways that God is perhaps opening a door for us to move through. I know of highly creative people who have been burdened with all kinds of mental struggles, but they're creative. They have done amazing things in their lives, um, and they've struggled with the suffering, with the mental suffering, but yet that hasn't limited them. And so, how do you? I think by being truly present to them, you encourage them to listen to the ways, to recognize the ways that they're being asked to move forward and to be a part of their own healing process.
mm. Amazing. I could wish I could just we could keep chatting all day. I always like to give an opportunity to the guest to make mention of anything that we haven't already discussed. Any final words for someone who is listening, who sees the title, compassionate listening for those suffering from mental illness. Any final words for the person who's listening?
I would just say that there are so many opportunities and avenues for us to take to help us to address the challenge that we face. And I think we should open ourselves to these opportunities, whether they're coming from a medical profession or a spiritual tradition. And I think the the vehicle for being able to be attentive to the ways that these other methods and therapies and opportunities can help us is to open ourselves to the practice of
Hmm.
deep listening to one another, deep listening, and to be communities. Wouldn't it be great if we were known as the human race that learned how to listen? Wow. Wow. Wouldn't there be world peace if we were a human race that learned how to listen? Wouldn't we have holistic healing if we were a human race that knew how to listen? And I think that that's what I would like to offer. And things take time. Even I've been helping our sisters and other communities with compassionate listening for 20 years, Imran. 20 years I've been working with this, and still I feel I'm at the very beginning. Look at what we're going through now in our current political situation, our social situation, be it national or global.
Yeah.
What is it suffering from? Inability to listen,
Hmm.
inability to recognize the feelings, the needs, and the concerns and the values of other traditions, of other countries, of other peoples, of other groups. And
Even
so,
oneself. Yeah. Like not.
even oneself, right?
Yeah.
And I also think that for those of us who are challenged, in any kind of particular, mental challenges or social challenges, that compassionate listening to one's own self is helpful.
Hmm.
Listen to what it is that God is. Listen, even if you don't believe in God, listen to what is happening to you in the deepest part of your being, and try to be attentive to it and try to use that to move forward,
Hmm.
to be at peace, but also to move forward.
Hmm. Thank you, Dr. Farina, for this wonderful conversation. Uh,
Thank you for the opportunity to share.
yes, yes. Hopefully we'll have you again, and I'll send you the recording once it's ready.
Thank you. Thank you. And if I could be of any help, in the future, if there's a little group that wants to form a little compassionate listening circle, have a little training, you let
Yeah,
me know. I would be happy to. I have done it online. It hasn't been the most successful. I mean, of course, it's better in person, but a small group online, I think we could go through some of the practices a little bit, and it might be an interesting next step.
wonderful, wonderful. I'm gonna hit stop on the recording, but I will put Sister Marianne's website, her page, so if you would like to reach out to her about some of the things that she's mentioned, you may do so. Thank you, Dr. Farina.
Thank you.